Hello, and welcome back to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems. This week, in this module, we're going to go and look at the strange and quixotic efforts to come up with a unified, synthetic theory of evolution, which goes pretty much against the view that I was trying to propose in the last module, where we looked at this most simple summary of the minimal conditions that you need for Darwinian evolution. In the words of Richard Lewontin, you need phenotypic variation. You need some sort of fitness differences between those phenotypes and a way to inherit them, to pass them on to your offspring, and you get evolution by natural selection. This seemingly simple process can be unwrapped and looked at from various perspectives, and we covered 4 of those in the last module. Structural perspectives, such as the sort of unit of selection debate. Functional perspectives, such as the replicator in interactor perspective propagated by Dawkins and David Hull, and process perspectives, especially James Grisham's reproducer perspective that embeds the replicator in a closed life cycle with development and shows that such a life cycle is absolutely necessary for the activity of replication. And last but not least, an agential perspective, such as the one put forward by Dennis Walsh, which takes the agency of organisms and their interactions with the environment really serious. So this simple caricature of evolution can be fruitfully looked at from at least 4 different perspectives. And that seems to indicate that what we need is a sort of a cross-perspectival approach and cooperation. So here's James Grisham, and he writes, I urge trans-perspective cooperation in the service of comparative analysis. Robustness analysis of the sort I advocate requires patient attention to those research packages one does not adopt for the sake of learning about the prospects and limitations of the one to which one has made a primary commitment. So we need to step out of our own perspective, to see the limitations, the blind spots, to see which concepts we have in our perspective carry over to other perspectives robustly and which ones do not, are sensitive to our own assumptions. And so that strongly indicates that open evolution as a radically emergent process, it makes sense, right? That constantly generates novelty by rewriting its own rules requires an open-ended and open-minded perspectival approach. So the rules are constantly changing. You need to come up with constantly new approaches to tackle the new questions that arise. And it's sort of bizarre that you would think that you could have a theory that in a few, just a few basic principles states all the rules you need to know for evolution. Well, you could say Lewontin's summary of Darwin's theory is one of these. And that's true. So this is also historically where this drive towards synthesis, towards unification comes from, I think. So Darwin's theory itself stands out. Of course, there were predecessors like Lamarck that also came out with Grand Unifying Theory, but Darwin stuck and stayed with us. So basically, this is the one big historical event in biology where someone formulated a general theory based on really modest metaphysical principles. And it's great. So let's look at it and how it is so general. So Charles Darwin himself, I'm quoting him through Dennis Walsh's book here, is saying in his Origin of Species, it may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers. So all of these things, natural selection, everything, that's also from the origin, follow inevitably from the struggle of existence, from the individual's struggle. Natural selection, now this is a quote from Neil Tennant's analysis of explanation in evolutionary biology. Natural selection is an analytic consequence of the lives, deaths, and reproduction of individuals. All these narratives, these fates, individual fates, they are the basis for Darwin's theory. It's beautiful. It's basically the same as the agential perspective that we talked about last time. Everything comes out of the activity of the individual and its fate. Okay? This is extremely, very different from modern evolutionary theory. You have to be aware of this. But it's also very powerful. It doesn't assume much except, well, this big assumption, but also observable fact that organisms struggle for existence. They want to live. And so Darwin was hailed, and we'll see more about that in just a little bit, as the sort of first sort of person who introduced population thinking. That's not quite true. I'll come back to that later. But I mean, the first thing to notice about that is that there are two very different ways of thinking about populations. The first one is Malthusian, which is Darwin's way of thinking about populations. So he explains population level phenomena as aggregate effects of individuals' activities. So it's everything that happens together, but it's based on the activity of the individual. But then Darwin's cousin and originator of eugenics, among other things, also statistician, comes up with a different kind of population thinking. And that's a very important shift. So here, explanation happens in terms of statistical properties of a population. So they describe distributions. No individuals are required. Explanation is in terms of the distribution of different traits. So this is an additional step from the Malthusian way of seeing the population. It abstracts away from the individual. You're purely working with the statistical distributions now. And so you forget about the individual. Very different. Two very different ontologies. In one, the activity of the individual is causally connected to natural selection, Darwin's theory. And in Galton's view, is a purely statistical theory that deals with statistical distributions in populations. Another interesting aspect of Darwin's theory that few people actually consider is the problem of heredity itself. Darwin had a huge problem because he didn't know how heredity worked, and it was very central to his theory. In fact, most 19th century epigenetic theories that were the mainstream theories of heredity at the time, they treated heredity as the passing on of developmental processes and not traits from parents to offspring. It was a very broad concept of heredity. And remember, this is what I advocated and James Griswomer advocates in the reproducer perspective as well. So Darwin's own theory of pangenesis is a perfect example of such a very broad theory. So Darwin believed in these gemulae, which would sort of aggregate in all your parts. For example, a gemule from your hand would go to your germline and then be passed on and then form the hand of your offspring. And so these gemulae were seen as both product and cause of development. So a very sort of epigenetic theory. Now, in this view, heredity and adaptation are seen as opposites. They work against each other. Okay, and it was not clear at the time of Darwin how this works. Okay, because you get blending inheritance and all sorts of problems. So heredity is the sort of factor of the identity of type. Okay, so basically a conservative force, and adaptation, of course, is a force for change. So they were seen as two different opposites. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to draw a lot on Ron Amundsen's book called The Changing Role of the Embryo in Evolutionary Thought. I can't recommend this book strongly enough. It's an absolutely fantastic history, not just of Evo-Devo, but of structuralist thinking all the way back to Saint-Hilaire and even before. So I'm going to use his account of the origin of what we call the modern synthetic theory of evolution. That's the second example of a synthetic theory after Darwin's origin. And so here's the short version of this story. So Ron, in his book, writes, ever since Darwin, it has been recognized that evolution is an interplay of heredity and adaptation. There's nothing new in this. During the 19th century, heredity was itself considered to be an aspect of the embryological development of the individual organism. Few people know this. The term heredity, by the way, comes from inheriting money from your parents. So it was adopted from that as a metaphor. Partly for this reason, 19th century evolutionary concepts intertwined embryology with heredity and adaptation. Development was a natural sort of ingredient. They all believed in this reproducer perspective, although they didn't really formulate it. early in the 20th century, the Mendelian chromosomal theory of heredity, and I'm going to tell you what that is in a minute, was devised. According to the MCTH, heredity is completely distinct from embryological development. That was the move. Goes back to Weismann, that allows you to get development out of the game. In the 1930s and the 1940s, then the MCTH was combined with population genetics and other fields to form the evolutionary synthesis. Development remained irrelevant to heredity, and no additional reason was found to justify the study of development by synthesis evolutionists. It was not relevant to their theory at all. So the discovery that development is irrelevant to evolution was no more problematic than the discovery that astrology is irrelevant to disease. Well, or so the story goes. As Ron writes, there's a large grain of truth in this story, but it's not the whole truth. So let's give you a slightly more detailed and revised version of it. So the first part is this redefinition of heredity, which is very important. So the rediscovery of Mendel led to this sort of macro-mutationist genetic school. De Vries and other people, they believed that the driving force of evolution were macro-mutations, mutations with large effects. And so it took the origin of genetics in Thomas Hunt Morgan's lab to sort of bring together a Mendelian view and a Darwinian view of evolution. Okay, and he did that by claiming, based on his work, on his empirical evidence, the work he did on flies, that there are Mendelian particulate traits. So there are real genes, factors that are transmitted. And we used earlier in the course this example of the 20-odd different genes that affect eye color. So Morgan's theory was based on that sort of work. And he combined it with August Weismann's chromosomal theory. Weismann had claimed that the chromosomes are the carriers of those particular traits, but had a weird sort of evolution theory about how chromosomes were involved in development. So in Morgan's theory, genes determine traits, okay, based on his fly work, the phenotypes. This was a new distinction. So here's where the genotype-phenotype distinction comes into history. But, and he realized that, 20-odd genes involved in fly eyes, you know, this is a complicated relationship. So it's not true that they believed in one gene, one trait. It wasn't quite that simple, but there was a deterministic relationship between genes and phenotypes. The mechanism of development was still completely unknown, of course. Actually, Morgan was a developmental biologist before an embryologist, before he became the founder of genetics, classical genetics. But as long as there is some determinate relation between genes and phenotypes, it can be safely ignored when studying transmission genetics. The two processes are separated causally in this view, which comes directly out of this fact that you have a much narrower concept of heredity now. And this, of course, is called the Mendelian chromosomal theory of heredity by Ron Amundsen. So this was crucial because it was the thing that enabled the development of population genetics in the 1920s and 1930s. Here, Ronald Fisher, Cyril Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane, the fathers of population genetics. And population genetics could take a serious statistical look. It took the Galtonian approach and then this sort of narrow view of heredity and combined them into a statistical description of populations. It managed to unify discrete genotypes versus continuous phenotypes by saying there's often a lot of genes involved in one particular trait. It treated sexually reproducing populations as gene pools. It abstracted away from the organism completely. So a gene pool is a beautiful metaphor. So the genes are swimming around in a pool, changing over time due to a limited number of parameters. And that's very important. So there's only a bunch of parameters that influence this process: mutation rate, migration, selection, and drift. Mutation here is backgrounded. I'll come back to that. And development is completely excluded. So this is a highly abstracted and idealized, but very rigorously formalized and precise theory. So it was very powerful and at this time, probably a necessary move to simplify the problem to make any progress, because the mechanisms of development were completely unknown, remember. So this was then sort of developed into what is called the evolutionary synthesis or the modern synthesis. It's a genius name. I mean, everything that comes after the modern synthesis has to be unmodern or postmodern or something like that. It's great. And the first time it was sort of explicitly coming together is in this book by Theodosius Dobzhansky called Genetics and the Origin of Species, published in 1937. And in this book, Dobzhansky writes, since evolution is a change in the genetic composition of populations, the mechanisms of evolution constitute problems in population genetics, period. Okay. This is a complete redefinition of Darwin's theory, which was a theory of organisms. It was a causal theory based on the activity of individuals. This theory is a theory of genes. It's a statistical theory based on distributions of traits, gene frequencies in population. And this was then supplemented by canonical writings in the 30s and the 40s by Stebbins, Simpson, Julian Huxley, Ernst Mayr, Resch, and others, culminating in a 1947 conference in Princeton, where people had reached a lot of agreement on the basic principles and a feeling of unity about what the principles of evolutionary theory are. So that's interesting, a feeling of unity. This was how it was reported. It's a great term. So let's look at that. So the modern synthesis is basically a unification of genetics, so Morgan's theory, with Darwinism, okay? Its proponents envisaged a coherent, falsifiable theory of genetic evolution. This is around the time of the logical positivists are very popular, so this was supposed to be a rigorous theory. Okay, falsifiable. The synthesis justifies the Darwinian view of gradual adaptation. That's very important. And all other modes of change were declared illegitimate. Saltationism, all these kind of things were just declared to be not happening, because they contradicted the principles of the formalized core of the theory. And it was explicitly aimed at unifying all evolutionary thinking based on population genetics. Okay, so the 5 core components of what you could call the original modern synthesis were mutations are random with respect to adaptation. That's very important. And their role, and that's also important, is purely to supply the genetic variation required for natural selection. They're not themselves a driver of innovation. Selection is the primary directional force, in evolution force, in scare quotes here, it's not really a force, and it's largely restricted to the individual level. You know, there was a unit of selection debate and it's still going on, but you know, in this view, the unit is the individual that's being selected. Recombination occurs in sexually reproducing populations. Isolation, a mechanism for preventing gene flow, causes speciation. So very famously, Ernst Mayr thought that species originate through allopatric speciation, where 2 populations get separated and then develop incompatibilities genetically to their mutual reproduction, like went hand in hand with his biological species concept. This is an interesting, so this is a verbal model, you realize. It's a verbal argument, we'll come back to that. Drift is important in small enough populations as well. It's not all selection. Okay, very simple principles, core components in the evolutionary synthesis. So here's the first sort of observation. This is not really a synthesis, but it's sort of a constriction, okay? It says, in order to understand evolution, we should only focus on population level dynamics. We should only focus on very few factors, just as those core components that I was just listing. So the official historian of the modern synthesis, Will Provine, here writes in an article from 1988, the evolutionary synthesis was not so much a synthesis as it was a vast cut down of variables considered important in the evolutionary process. What was new in this conception of evolution was not the individual variables, most of which had been long recognized. They were already there. But the idea that evolution depended on so few of them. They threw stuff out. They didn't bring new stuff in like you would expect from a synthesis. This I will now call the evolutionary constriction, which seems to me be a more accurate description of what actually happened to evolutionary biology. Wow, okay, so this is a man very sympathetic to the idea of synthesis, but he says there is no synthesis here. And also other people, Richard Lewontin, a core sort of member of what people think about standard evolutionary theory, he's critical. He says a description and explanation of genetic change in a population is a description and explanation of evolutionary change only insofar as we can link those genetic changes to the manifest diversity of living organisms. How do you do that? Well, you need development. to concentrate only on genetic change without attempting to relate it to the kinds of physiological, morphogenetic, and behavioral evolution that are manifest in the fossil record and the diversity of extant organisms and communities is to forget entirely what it is we are trying to explain in the first place. He says, okay, we have sacrificed relevance for the sake of rigor, okay? So it's a very sort of focused theory, okay? But there are really serious limitations to its scope and its rigor, by the way, too, because the synthetic theory is only formalized and consistent within the limits of its population genetics core, nowhere else, okay? So the theory, of course, does not deal with development, behavior, or even ecology in the first place, which is a problem, the original theory. And various extrapolations are required to connect to even paleontology, systematic, sort of the broad trends of evolution, macroevolution in general. So these sort of extrapolations are not formalized at all. They are also not consistent with each other. They're just a bunch of local verbal formulations, local qualitative models, okay? So they're heaping on to this sort of, rigorous core of the theory, as you would understand scientific theory in the traditional sense. And here is Arlin Stoltzfus writing in his 2017 article, these verbal and qualitative theories are the arms and the legs of the original modern synthesis, the parts that do all the work, okay? So the stuff that really connects it to reality in the way that Richard Lewontin wants is the stuff that is not rigorously formulated, that is not a coherent formalized theory at all. It's just a bunch of models that are heaped on top of this population genetics core. Okay, so where do we go with that? So this was the original sort of really rigorous attempt at synthesis, at unification. Okay, this idea quickly evolved. It was never sort of stagnant or constant. So by 1959, there was a huge celebration of Darwin's centennial of the origin of species in Chicago. And this celebration, here you can see the panel, not exactly good gender balance in this panel. It was a celebration of the unification of evolutionary theory, apparently. That was the slogan. And it brought something to the fore that was very important later on, something called synthesis historiography. So they started rewriting history. The first thing they did, Ernst Mayr did this, is he reinvented Darwin as the father of this discipline, although Darwin's view of the organism in evolution was completely different than the genetic theory they had. Also, the idea that Darwin was the first population thinker, as is claimed, we've seen, is not really accurate. Okay, so rewriting of history here. The evolutionary synthesis is now suddenly in Darwin's tradition, which it wasn't before. Evolutionary mechanisms, that's a funny word, I don't know what that is, we'll come back to that, operate exclusively at the population level. That's it, okay? Selection, drift, migration. So again, very narrow sort of view. And originally, it was planned that there was some sort of panel or discussion on development. Waddington was supposed to participate, but he was kicked out at a planning meeting the year before, so he wasn't part of the centennial celebrations in the end. So what happened to embryology in all of this? Ernst Mayr famously said, the embryologists were not kept away from this whole endeavor, but developmental biologists simply were not interested in participating in the synthesis. And this is, it's like bullying someone in school and then saying, oh, they didn't want to play with me, right? Because what happened is that Morgan, for example, adopted this sort of quasi-positivism. And this is beautiful, he said, science should be clearly separated from philosophy, especially metaphysics, because they are useless, okay? And so embryology, he aligned with metaphysics. It's full of philosophical platitudes rather than experimentally determined factors. This is great. I mean, classical embryology was a really conceptually rich field, which was actually having a lot of success at the time, the centennial and also before when Morgan was writing this. Okay, but it's all metaphysics, and this is beautiful because how many molecular biologists have you talked to that are actually holding this sort of view today? Still, it's terrible. I don't have a philosophy, I have facts. Well, that's a philosophy. So genetics was seen by Morgan and his followers as the successor, not a partner of embryology, even though, as I said, embryology was having its heyday. I mean, this was right after Speymann's organizer and all these kind of discoveries, and it was going really well. So it wasn't just that, you know, there were ideological reasons why development was excluded. And the chief ideologist of this sort of movement was Ernst Mayr. So he came up around this time in the late 50s with four dichotomies that were supposed to guide evolutionary thinking. One was Weismann's germline versus soma distinction. The second one was Johansson's, or better, Morgan's genotype-phenotype separation. And then he brought in two of his own. One is the famous proximate versus ultimate causation distinction that we talked about plenty before in this course. And the last one is what he called typological versus population thinking. Typological thinking was bad. It was essentialist. So they rewrote the whole history of evolutionary biology before Darwin as some sort of mystical Platonism or Aristotelian essentialism, where you looked for some mystical transcendental essences that don't really exist. They thought racism was a you know, coming from typological thinking. It was really bad. It was a very politically motivated discussion. And they said population thinking is the natural way to think about biology, because the political agenda here, and this is more and more, we get into this sort of shift from real theory to politics and sociology of science, okay? So the political motivation behind this was to defend Mayer's own field of what he called naturalistic organismic field biology over these sort of molecular biologists in labs that were threatening his field by sucking out all the money from him and all that. And so he said, use this sort of, especially the last two dichotomies. Ultimate causation, that's evolutionary biology. Population thinking, that's field biology. You know, that's what we do in the field. He used those to defend his own field against the threat of molecular biology. So what also happened in parallel to that is an increasing adaptationism. So this was called by Stephen Jay Gould the hardening of the modern synthesis. So the focus was increasingly on natural selection and you know, as the primary force of adaptation in evolution. But then, and this shows you just how political this was and how little theory there was behind this, Mayr smoothly turns over the next 20 years and uses the same arguments that he used against molecular biology, you know, what he called functional biology. He quickly adapts those arguments and defends the synthesis against new criticisms coming from the newly emerging field of evolutionary developmental biology. And here, the terms, it's a very smooth pivot. Okay, they become completely different, right? So now we're supposed to disqualify proximate explanations, which are developmental explanations. And the developmental biologists are typological thinkers. So they fundamentally don't get the point about evolution in Mayer's view. Okay, and he shifts the use of these arguments smoothly from a sort of defending a naturalist field biology to defending a reductionist sort of minimalist thinking about evolution from the complications of bringing development into it. Very smooth, completely politically motivated. So we'll see more and more of this sort of political action here that has nothing to do with theory, okay? The theory here is constructed for political use, okay? That's very important to notice. And this sort of culminates in the 1980 sort of book edited by Mayr and Provine, a thick volume full of really good stuff, good people writing, including, which is interesting, by that time, one chapter about embryology and the modern synthesis by embryologist Victor Hamburger. And so he argued that you need to open the black box of development for the synthesis to be complete. And he got a lot of hostility in the 80s for this. Okay, so this was no longer sort of, you know, a matter of different perspectives. It was a real competition and it was really serious. So now there was a real sort of aggression almost against developmental biology. So, but of course, if we look at this from sort of this Vinsatian Grismer type of view, and also Ron Amundsen is adopting this, he says, well, the problem here is not that one side is right and the other one is wrong. They have different perspectives on the same problem. Okay, so the adaptationists of the synthesis, they think, individuals don't evolve. We've seen this before, by the way. Populations do. Species are effects of the evolution of populations, while structuralists, that's the embryologists, the developmental biologists, they say individuals don't evolve, ontogenies do. Characters are effects of the evolution of ontogeny. We're going to explore that second view and the critiques it had of this sort of synthesis thinking in next lecture. But coming back to what is called the modern synthesis, it is not a synthesis. First of all, I showed you before, there's just a core of theory. The rest is just models heaped onto it. And then also there's a lot of disunity in the last few 50 or 60 years in this field, okay? So the first big schism, of course, is molecular evolution. Meyer was very much against these ideas of neutral evolution. He said neutral evolution is not evolution, this molecular clock kind of stuff. That doesn't involve natural selection. So it's not evolution at all. It's just random stuff. Okay, and that reflects a sort of a general negligence of mutation-driven evolutionary dynamics. Okay, and so this sort of view has changed a lot over the last few decades. So a lot of the modern evolutionary geneticists are really serious about the effects of de novo mutations. So it's not like the modern synthesis at all anymore. Okay, so another problem is the synthesis does not apply to microbial evolution. Okay, so these guys, they don't have gene pools. They spread their genes all over the place. There's no, lineages and all that. It's a real problem. Nowadays, what is called, sort of the standard theory of evolution it includes all kinds of models and views that are tacked on, that are inconsistent. It's a big mess, So niche construction is a traditional, sort of field of study in evolutionary genetics. There's no problem with that, okay? So it's a very heterogeneous field. There is no it's not unified, and there is no agreement among the members of these fields, and I don't see why there has to be. Okay, so the modern synthesis is not a theory. It's a cultural tradition, a historical tradition that existed at some point. We're not sure it exists anymore. A lot of biology and evolution may still be in that tradition, but there's a lot of different fragrances of it, and it's not a unified sort of thing at all. And I love this. This is from Arlin Stoltzfus' paper again. He calls synthesis historiography, the revisionist history that they produced, a conceptual immune system to keep the tradition going. Okay, so you should see the modern synthesis not as a sort of a theory, but sort of a historical tradition. So basically, to wrap up, the modern synthesis is not and never was a unified theory of framework. Okay, so it is not a synthesis at all. But at least it tried, okay? That was the original intent, was to unify thinking just like Darwin did. So they were inspired by Darwin. And at the time it had good reason to. It was a really good move to exclude the complications of development and ecology because they made progress. They were simplifying, and in their corner of the universe, they could make really good progress. And we have a really good formal theory of genetic evolution now, which is a wonderful thing to have. We need it. Okay, so, but instead, it was, as Provine was writing, it was more of a theoretical constriction, if it was anything at all. So it was a sort of a narrowing of the mind, saying, oh, only this is evolutionary biology. Only if you look at population level processes do you do evolutionary biology. That's not a good thing. And also, it's more of a historical narrative or cultural tradition. It's really hard to define. It's an evolving, moving target. Its exact content and its limitations are and have always been unclear and always change, okay, over time. So this is not some sort of monolithic theory that you're fighting against or that you want to revise. You can't revise it. It's revising itself all the time, okay? So let me finish up by a few wonderful quotes by Arlin Stoltzfus in his absolutely wonderful paper, which is entitled, Why We Don't Want Another Synthesis. Okay, so the synthesis narrative, which is maintained only by enormous sacrifices of rigor and clarity nowadays, must be abandoned. Okay, it's been a sort of a story that's been put onto history. It's not been real at any point of time. There's a lot of political propaganda here, rewriting of history. The historical narrative of the Grand Unifying Theory is false, and evolutionary biology does not need a master theory. It is the process that creates diversity. Why on earth do we need a synthetic theory? I don't know. Okay, so then, against this sort of straw man argument that there is a theory that is called the modern synthesis, Arlin writes, the correct term for contemporary mainstream thinking in evolution is contemporary mainstream thinking in evolution. It's very diverse. It's always evolving itself. It has all kinds of perspectives. And that is exactly how it should be. So in this slide, in the next lecture, we're going to look at attempts at doing theory in Evo Devo. A certain disappointment that it never brought out the really general theory, which I don't think is a problem at all, but a diversity of models, which is really good. And then in the lecture after that, we're going to look at the bizarre idea of extending this synthesis that doesn't work and doesn't exist. It's just completely bizarre. I hope you'll tune in again next time. Thanks for listening.